The morning sun cast long shadows across the red desert rocks as Ayana sat outside her family's small adobe house, grinding corn for the day's bread. At 19, she had the calloused hands of someone who had worked since childhood, but her eyes held dreams that stretched far beyond the boundaries of her small tribal community in the southwestern desert. She hummed an old song her grandmother had taught her while she worked, the same melody that had comforted her through countless dawns just like this one. But today felt different. Today she could feel the weight of expectant stares from the other women in the settlement, and she knew what was coming. Her mother appeared in the doorway, wringing her hands nervously. "The council wants to see you," she said quietly, unable to meet her daughter's gaze. "Your grandfather is waiting." Ayana's stomach dropped. She had been dreading this moment for weeks, ever since the whispered conversations had started, the ones that stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room. She set down her grinding stone and wiped her hands on her worn cotton dress. The council house stood at the center of their small community, its weathered walls holding decades of important decisions. As Ayana approached, she could see the serious faces of the 5 elderly men who governed their people. Her grandfather, Chief Running Wolf, sat in the center, his lined face stern and unreadable. "Ayana," he began in their native tongue, his voice carrying the authority of generations. "You know why you are here?" She nodded, her heart racing. "I do, grandfather. The Martinez family from the Eastern Settlement has made a generous offer. Their eldest son, Diego, is 32 years old, owns many cattle, and can provide well for a wife. The union would strengthen our ties and settle the debt our family owes them from the drought years." The room fell silent except for the sound of wind whistling through the wooden beams. Ayana had met Diego Martinez twice. He was not unkind, but he was a stranger who looked at her like property to be acquired. The thought of spending her life bearing his children and tending his house filled her with a cold dread. "I understand the honor of this proposal," she said carefully, "but I cannot accept." The sharp intake of breath from the council members told her that her refusal had shocked them, even though they had suspected it might come. Her grandfather's eyes flashed with anger and disappointment. "Cannot?" he repeated, his voice rising. "A young woman does not decide these matters. The good of our people comes before personal desires." But grandfather," Ayana stepped forward, her voice stronger now. "I have never spoken to this man beyond simple greetings. I do not know his heart, and he does not know mine. How can such a union bring happiness or strong children?" The oldest council member, Elder White Bear, shook his head sadly. "Happiness is a luxury, child. Survival is what matters. Our community has survived for hundreds of years because we understand duty and sacrifice." For 3 hours, the men tried every argument they could think of. They spoke of tradition, of family honor, of the practical benefits the marriage would bring. They reminded her of the years of drought when the Martinez family had shared their grain stores, keeping many from starvation, but with each passing minute, Ayana's resolve only grew stronger. She thought of her grandmother's stories about the old days, when women had been warriors and healers, when they had voices in important matters. She thought of the books the traveling teacher had brought last summer, stories of women who had chosen their own paths. "I will not marry a man I do not choose," she said finally. "I would rather live alone in the desert than be given away like a prize horse." The silence that followed was deafening. Her grandfather's face darkened with a rage she had never seen before. The other council members looked between each other, unsure how to respond to such unprecedented defiance. "You forget yourself, granddaughter," Chief Running Wolf said, his voice deadly quiet. "You forget who you are and where you come from." "I know exactly who I am," Ayana replied, surprising herself with her boldness. "I am a woman who can think for herself. I can work as hard as any man, and I deserve the right to choose my own future." The argument that erupted lasted until sunset. Neighbors gathered outside, drawn by the raised voices carrying across the settlement. Ayana's mother wept quietly in the corner, torn between supporting her daughter and respecting the ways of their ancestors. When the moon rose high in the desert sky, The council finally reached their decision. Elder White Bear spoke the words that would change everything. Ayana, daughter of Maria, granddaughter of Chief Running Wolf, you have brought shame upon your family and shown disrespect for our sacred traditions. The Martinez family has been dishonored by your rejection. The balance must be restored. Her grandfather stood slowly, his weathered hands gripping his walking stick. If you will not accept the wisdom of your elders, if you will not fulfill your duty to your people, then you are no longer one of us. The desert that you claim to prefer over a good marriage will be your home. The words hit her like physical blows. Exile was the harshest punishment their people knew, reserved for the worst crimes against the community. No one had been exiled in her lifetime. You cannot mean this, her mother cried, rushing forward. She is just young and foolish. She will come to her senses. But Chief Running Wolf's decision was final. She has made her choice. Now she must live with it. She will be taken to the deep desert at sunrise. If she survives and finds her way to wisdom, perhaps the spirits will guide her back to us. If not, he left the sentence unfinished. That night was the longest of Ayana's life. Her mother packed a small bundle of dried meat and filled a leather water pouch, tears streaming down her face. Her younger sister Rosa held her tightly, begging her to change her mind even now. It's not too late, Rosa whispered. Just say yes to the marriage, please. But Ayana could not bring herself to surrender. Something deep inside her rebelled against the idea of trading her freedom for safety. She had heard her grandmother's stories too many times, had felt the call of something greater than the small life that was being mapped out for her. As dawn broke over the red rocks, 3 men came for her. They drove an old truck that rattled and wheezed as it carried her, deeper and deeper into the vast desert wasteland. No one spoke during the journey. The silence was broken only by the sound of the engine and the wind whistling through the open windows. After what felt like hours, they stopped at a place where nothing grew except twisted cactus and thorny brush. The men avoided looking at her as they helped her down from the truck bed. One of them, her cousin Miguel, pressed the water pouch into her hands. I'm sorry, he whispered, then quickly looked away. The truck disappeared in a cloud of dust, leaving her alone in a landscape that stretched endlessly in every direction. The morning sun was already beginning to heat the air, and she knew that by midday, the desert would become a furnace that could kill an unprepared traveler in hours. For the first time since this nightmare began, Ayana allowed herself to cry. She stood in that vast emptiness, surrounded by silence so complete it seemed to press against her ears, and wondered if her stubborn pride had just cost her everything, including her life. But even as fear crept through her body, she knew she could not regret her choice. She wiped her tears and looked around, trying to remember everything her grandmother had taught her about reading the desert's signs. If she was going to survive, she would need every scrap of knowledge she could recall. The sun climbed higher, and Ayana began to walk. The desert heat hit Ayana like a physical blow as she began walking. By 10 in the morning, the sun had already turned the sand and rocks into a furnace that seemed to pull moisture from her body with every breath. She had tied her long black hair up with strips torn from her dress, trying to keep it off her neck, but sweat still ran down her back despite her efforts to stay cool. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory as she walked. The desert is not your enemy, little one, the old woman had said during their long walks when Ayana was just 7 years old. But it does not forgive mistakes. Respect it, and it might let you live. She tried to remember everything from those childhood lessons: walk during the cooler parts of the day, rest in shade when possible, don't waste water by drinking too much at once, look for signs of life, because where plants and animals survive, humans might too. The first day was the hardest. Her soft leather shoes, made for walking on packed earth around the settlement, began to fall apart on the rough rocks and thorny plants. By evening, her feet were bleeding from cuts and scrapes. She found a small overhang of rock that provided some shelter and curled up there as the temperature dropped rapidly. The desert night was nothing like the warm evenings back home. Without the sun's heat, the air became so cold that her breath came out in small puffs. She had no blanket, no fire, nothing but her cotton dress and the determination to survive until morning. Sleep came in short, uncomfortable periods between. Bouts of shivering. The second day brought new challenges. Her lips were already cracking from the dry air, and her water supply was dropping faster than she had hoped. But she found her first bit of hope when she spotted a prickly pear cactus with ripe purple fruit. Her grandmother had shown her how to carefully remove the tiny spines and eat the sweet flesh inside. The fruit was a blessing, providing both moisture and energy. She ate 3 of them slowly, savoring each bite and feeling slightly more optimistic about her chances. If she could find food, maybe she could survive long enough to find water or reach civilization. On the 3rd day, disaster struck. While climbing over a rocky outcrop, she slipped and fell hard on her left ankle. The pain shot through her leg like fire, and for several terrifying minutes, she thought she might have broken it. She sat on the hot rocks, fighting back tears and panic as she gently tested the injury. It was sprained, not broken, but it swelled quickly and made walking extremely painful. Every step now required tremendous effort and willpower. She fashioned a crude walking stick from a piece of dried cactus wood, but progress became painfully slow. The heat seemed worse on the 3rd day. The sun felt like it was pressing down on her with the weight of a heavy blanket. She rationed her water carefully, taking tiny sips that barely wet her mouth. Her tongue felt thick and dry, and her head began to pound with the first signs of serious dehydration. That afternoon, she found another small miracle. Tucked between 2 large boulders was a tiny natural pool where rainwater had collected. It was only about 6 inches deep and covered with a thin film of dust and dead insects. But it was water. She carefully skimmed off the debris and filled her leather pouch, then drank deeply for the first time in 2 days. The water gave her enough strength to continue, but by the 4th day she was in serious trouble. Her injured ankle had turned purple and yellow, and the constant pain made it hard to focus on anything else. Worse, she had eaten the last of her dried meat the night before, and finding food was becoming desperate. She tried eating some desert plants she thought she recognized, but they were bitter and made her stomach cramp. Without her grandmother there to guide her, she was afraid to experiment too much with unfamiliar plants. Getting sick from poison would be a death sentence in her current condition. The hallucinations started that afternoon. She began seeing things that weren't there. Lakes of cool blue water shimmering in the distance, her mother calling her name from behind rocky hills, even her grandfather walking toward her with his arms outstretched. Each time she blinked and found herself alone again in the endless expanse of sand and stone. Her legs felt like they were made of lead as she forced herself to keep moving, 1 foot in front of the other, using her walking stick to steady herself on the uneven ground. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she could feel her skin burning despite her efforts to stay covered. That night, huddled against another rock formation, she seriously considered giving up. The cold made her injuries ache worse, and she was so thirsty that her throat felt like sandpaper. She thought about her family back home, probably sitting around their dinner fire, wondering if she was already dead. Part of her wanted to lie down and stop fighting. It would be easier to just close her eyes and let the desert take her. At least then, the pain would stop. But something deep inside refused to quit. Maybe it was the same stubborn streak that had gotten her into this mess in the first place. The 5th day dawned clear and brutally hot. Ayana's water was almost gone, just a few sips left in the bottom of her pouch. She could barely think straight, and walking had become an act of pure will rather than conscious decision. She stumbled forward like a person in a dream, her vision blurry and her mouth so dry she couldn't swallow. It was around midday when she saw it, a thin line stretching across the desert that didn't look natural. She blinked several times, sure it was another hallucination, but it remained steady in her vision. A fence line, old and weathered but definitely man-made. Hope gave her a burst of energy she didn't know she still had. She hobbled toward the fence as fast as her injured ankle would allow, following it as it curved around a low hill. Her heart pounded with excitement and fear. What if the fence led nowhere? What if whatever lay beyond it was abandoned? But as she crested the hill, she saw the most beautiful sight of her life. A small ranch house sat in a shallow valley, with a barn and several outbuildings nearby. Smoke was coming from the chimney, which meant someone was home. Cattle grazed in a fenced pasture, and she could see the glint of sunlight on what had to be a water tank. Her legs almost gave out from relief. She was going to live. After 5 days of hell, she had found salvation. She started down the hill as quickly as she could manage. But her body had reached its absolute limit. The world began to spin around her as she got closer to the house. Her vision narrowed to a dark tunnel, and her legs felt like rubber. She made it to the wooden porch steps before her strength finally ran out completely. The last thing she remembered was the sound of her body hitting the weathered boards, and a man's voice shouting in surprise from somewhere inside the house. Thomas Mackenzie was sitting at his kitchen table, drinking black coffee and staring out the window at his cattle, when the loud thud on his front porch made him jump. In 12 years of living alone on this remote ranch, the only visitors he'd had were the occasional supply truck driver and maybe a lost coyote looking for water. He set down his coffee cup and listened carefully. The sound hadn't been repeated, but something felt different in the air. His old dog Rex, who usually barked at every prairie dog within a mile, was whining softly by the front door instead of raising his usual alarm. Thomas walked slowly to the door, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. He hadn't spoken to another human being in 3 months, not since the supply run to town in early spring. Living alone had become his choice after the accident that took his wife and 7-year-old daughter 5 years ago. The isolation felt safer than dealing with people's pity and well-meaning advice about moving on. When he opened the door, his breath caught in his throat. A young woman lay crumpled on his porch steps, her long black hair spread around her like a dark river. Her cotton dress was torn and dirty, her feet were bleeding, and her lips were cracked and white from dehydration. She looked more dead than alive. For a moment, Thomas just stood there, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Then his old instincts from his rodeo days kicked in. He'd seen plenty of injuries over the years, and he knew this girl was in serious trouble. "Jesus," he whispered, kneeling beside her. Her skin was hot to the touch and dry as paper. Her pulse was rapid and weak. She needed water immediately, but he also knew that giving too much too fast to someone this dehydrated could be dangerous. Thomas was a big man, over 6 feet tall, with arms made strong from years of ranch work. He lifted the unconscious girl as gently as he could and carried her into his house. His wife's sewing loom had been turned into a storage space years ago, but it still had a daybed where he sometimes napped during cattle season. He laid her down carefully and rushed to get cool water and clean cloths. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, which worried him. He'd seen cattle die from heat exhaustion, and humans weren't much different when it came to the basics of survival. First, he used damp cloths to cool her forehead and wrist, trying to bring her body temperature down gradually. Then he managed to get small sips of water past her cracked lips, just a few drops at a time. Too much water too quickly could make her sick or even kill her. For the first hour, he wasn't sure she would make it. Her breathing was so shallow he had to lean close to make sure she was still alive. But slowly, very slowly, her condition began to improve. Her skin started to feel less like leather, and her breathing became more regular. Thomas hadn't taken care of anyone since his daughter had gotten sick with fever 2 winters before the accident. The familiar motions of checking temperature, adjusting pillows, and monitoring breathing brought back memories he usually tried to keep buried. But this time, instead of making him sad, the memories seemed to give him purpose. When the girl finally opened her eyes near sunset, Thomas was sitting in a chair beside the bed, reading an old magazine. Her eyes were dark brown and filled with confusion and fear. She tried to sit up quickly, but immediately fell back down, her head spinning. "Easy there," Thomas said quietly, setting down his magazine. "You're safe. You were pretty badly dehydrated when I found you." The girl stared at him for a long moment, clearly trying to figure out where she was and what had happened. She tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper came out. Thomas quickly brought her more water, helping her drink slowly. "Thank you," she managed to say after a few sips. Her accent was slight but noticeable, and Thomas realized she was probably Native American. That explained how she'd ended up in the middle of nowhere. There were several tribal lands within 100 miles of his ranch. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Ayana," she whispered. "I'm Thomas Mackenzie. This is my ranch." He paused, studying her torn clothes and injured feet. "How did you end up out there in the desert? Did your car break down?" Ayana's eyes filled with tears, and she turned her face away. Thomas could see that whatever had happened to her was painful to think about. He'd learned over the years that sometimes people needed time before they could talk about difficult things. "That's okay," he said quickly. "You don't have to explain anything right now. The important thing is getting you healthy again." Over the next 3 days, Thomas fell into a routine he hadn't experienced in years. He brought Ayana meals 3 times a day, simple food like soup and bread that would be easy on her stomach. He changed the bandages on her feet and gave her clean clothes that had belonged to his wife. The clothes were too big, but Ayana accepted them gratefully. She seemed amazed by simple things like hot soup and soft blankets. Thomas found himself wondering what kind of life she'd been living before ending up in his desert. Communication was challenging at first. Ayana's English was limited, and Thomas knew no words in her native language. But gradually they began to understand each other through gestures and simple words. She would point to things and tell him the names in her language, and he would repeat the English words slowly. On the 4th day, Ayana was strong enough to sit on the front porch. Thomas brought her coffee, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunrise paint the desert rocks in shades of red and gold. It was the most peaceful morning Thomas had experienced in years. "Your family," Thomas said carefully. "Are they looking for you?" Ayana's face darkened, and she shook her head firmly. Through broken English and hand gestures, she managed to tell him that her family had sent her away. Thomas didn't understand all the details, but he could see the pain in her eyes when she talked about it. That afternoon, while Ayana napped, Thomas found himself looking through old photo albums he hadn't touched in years. Pictures of his wife Linda and their daughter Katie filled the pages. For the first time since their deaths, looking at the photos didn't bring the usual crushing sadness. Instead, he felt something he'd almost forgotten, the warmth of having someone to care for. When Ayana woke up, she found Thomas in the kitchen, actually humming while he prepared dinner. She smiled at the sound, and Thomas realized he'd been humming an old song Linda used to love. Having another person in the house was bringing parts of himself back to life. That evening, as they ate dinner by lamplight, Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. "You can stay here as long as you need to," he told her. "I've got plenty of room, and to be honest, it's nice having someone around again." Ayana looked at him with such gratitude that Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him like that, like he mattered, like his kindness meant something. Neither of them realized it yet, but they had both found exactly what they needed. Thomas had found a reason to care about tomorrow again, and Ayana had found a place where she could heal from wounds that went much deeper than her injured feet. 3 weeks after finding Ayana on his porch, Thomas woke up to the sound of someone moving around in his kitchen. For a split second, he thought he was dreaming about his wife Linda making breakfast like she used to. Then reality settled in, and he smiled. Ayana was an early riser, just like he was. He found her standing at the window, holding a cup of coffee and watching the sunrise. She had learned to make coffee the way he liked it, strong and black. Her feet had healed enough that she could walk without limping, though she still moved carefully on the rougher ground outside. "Good morning," she said, turning to smile at him. Her English had improved dramatically over the past few weeks. Thomas had started leaving old magazines and books around the house, and she studied them like textbooks, asking him about words she didn't understand. "Morning," Thomas replied, accepting the coffee cup she handed him. "You're up early again." "I like the quiet time," she said. "Before the day gets busy." Thomas understood exactly what she meant. The early morning hours had always been his favorite part of the day, back when he had shared them with his family. Now, sharing them with Ayana felt natural and comfortable. After breakfast, they walked out to check on the cattle together. This had become their daily routine. Thomas had been amazed to discover that Ayana knew a lot about animals, even though she'd never worked on a ranch before. She could spot a sick cow from 50 yards away and had an almost magical ability to calm nervous horses. "My grandmother taught me," she explained when Thomas asked about her skills. "She said animals speak with their bodies, just like people. You just have to know how to listen." Thomas found himself learning from her as much as he was teaching her. She showed him how to read weather patterns in the way birds flew and how certain plants could predict rain. Her knowledge came from generations of people who had lived close to the land, while his came from books and modern farming techniques. Together, they made a surprisingly effective team. As the days passed, their conversations grew longer and deeper. Ayana told him more about her life before the desert, about growing up in a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business, about her dreams of seeing the world beyond the reservation boundaries, and about the forced marriage that had led to her exile. Thomas found himself sharing things he hadn't talked about in years. He told her about his rodeo days when he traveled from town to town competing and living out of his truck. He talked about meeting Linda at a county fair in Texas and how she had convinced him to settle down and buy the ranch. The hardest story to tell was about the accident. It happened on a rainy night when Thomas was driving home from town with his wife and daughter. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit them head-on. Linda and Katie died instantly. Thomas survived with nothing worse than a broken arm and cuts from broken glass, which somehow made the guilt worse. "I should have been driving more carefully," he said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars. "I should have seen that car coming." Ayana listened quietly, then spoke with the kind of wisdom that surprised him. "Bad things happen that we cannot control. The drunk man chose to drink and drive. You did not choose that. The guilt you carry belongs to him, not to you." Her simple words hit him harder than years of grief counseling had. Maybe it was because she had also lost everything she'd ever known, or maybe it was because she spoke without judgment or pity. Whatever the reason, Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, like a knot that had been tied too tight finally loosening. As summer moved toward fall, their partnership on the ranch grew stronger. Ayana learned to repair fences, operate the water pump, and even help with the more difficult cattle when they needed medical attention. Thomas taught her to drive his old pickup truck, which she mastered with the same determination she applied to everything else, but it was the small moments that meant the most to both of them. The way Ayana would hum old songs while she worked, filling the silence that had haunted the ranch for so long. The way Thomas would leave wildflowers on the kitchen table after his morning rides, because he'd noticed how Ayana's face lit up when she saw them one afternoon while they were working together to fix a broken gate. Thomas realized he was laughing at something Ayana had said. It was the first time he'd truly laughed since the accident. The sound felt rusty and strange, but also wonderful. Ayana noticed too. "You have a good laugh," she said. "It makes your eyes look younger." That evening, Thomas found himself looking in the bathroom mirror, really looking at himself for the first time in years. The man staring back at him was still grieving, would probably always be grieving. But he wasn't the hollow-eyed ghost he had been when Ayana first arrived. Meanwhile, Ayana was changing too. The frightened, desperate girl who had collapsed on his porch was growing into a confident woman who could hold her own in any conversation and handle any job the ranch threw at her. She still missed her family, but the bitter anger that had consumed her in the first weeks was fading into something more like acceptance. "I used to think I was being punished," she told Thomas one day while they were moving hay bales. "Now I think maybe I was being guided to where I needed to be." The comment made Thomas think about fate and coincidence. What were the odds that Ayana would collapse on the porch of the one man in a 100-mile radius who understood what it felt like to lose everything? What were the odds that two people who had given up on life would find exactly what they needed in each other? But their peaceful existence faced a growing challenge. Thomas began to worry about what would happen when winter came and supply trucks stopped making regular runs to town. More importantly, He worried about whether Ayana's family or the authorities might come looking for her one evening after they'd finished the day's work and were sitting down to dinner. Thomas brought up the subject that had been weighing on his mind. "Ayana," he said carefully, "we need to talk about your legal situation. If your family reported you missing, or if anyone comes looking for you, ... She looked up from her plate and he could see the fear flash across her face. The thought of being forced to leave had obviously occurred to her too. "I don't want to go back," she said quietly. "This place, this life we have here. It's the first time I've ever felt like I could be myself." Thomas nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I don't want you to leave either," he said. "But we need to make sure you're legally free to make that choice. Tomorrow I think we should drive to town and talk to a lawyer." The decision would change everything for both of them. They both knew that once they involved the outside world in their arrangement, their quiet, simple life might never be the same. But they also knew that hiding forever wasn't a real solution. As they cleaned up the dinner dishes together that night, both of them were thinking about the future for the first time in months. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The drive to town took 2 hours on dusty back roads that Thomas hadn't traveled in months. Ayana sat quietly in the passenger seat of his old pickup truck, watching the desert landscape slowly give way to scattered houses and small farms. She had never been this far from home before, and everything outside the truck window looked both exciting and terrifying. Thomas glanced at her nervous face and reached over to squeeze her hand briefly. "It's going to be okay," he said. "We're just getting information. Nobody's going to force you to do anything you don't want to do." The town of Cedar Springs wasn't much more than a main street lined with old buildings, a general store, a diner, and a few other small businesses. Most of the storefronts looked like they hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Thomas parked outside a small office with a faded sign that read, "Janet Martinez, Attorney at Law." Janet Martinez turned out to be a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her office was cramped but tidy, filled with law books and family photos. She listened carefully as Thomas and Ayana explained their situation, taking notes and asking gentle questions. "First, let me put your mind at ease about one important thing," Janet said to Ayana. "You're 19 years old, which means you're a legal adult. No one can force you to return to your family or enter into any marriage against your will. That's the law, regardless of cultural traditions." Ayana felt like a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had spent weeks worrying that someone might drag her back to face her grandfather's anger and disappointment. "However," Janet continued, "there are some practical matters we should address. Do you have any form of identification? Birth certificate, social security card, anything like that?" Ayana shook her head. She had never needed official papers living on the reservation. Everything there was handled through tribal records and family connections. Janet made more notes. "We can work on getting you proper documentation. It'll take some time, but it's definitely possible. In the meantime, Thomas, are you planning to employ Ayana officially?" Thomas had been thinking about this question for weeks. "I'd like to make her a partner in the ranch operation," he said. "Equal ownership, equal decision-making. She's earned it with all the work she's put in." Ayana turned to stare at him in shock. They had talked about her staying permanently, but she had never imagined he would offer her actual ownership of the land. "Thomas, I can't accept that," she said quickly. "This is your home, your life's work. I've only been here a few months." "And in those few months, you've brought this place back to life," Thomas replied firmly. "Before you came, I was just going through the motions, waiting to die. Now I actually care about the future again. That's worth more than you could ever repay with work." Janet smiled at the obvious affection between them. "It's unusual, but it's certainly legal. We can draw up partnership papers that would give you both equal rights to the property and business. Though I should warn you, Thomas, this kind of arrangement could complicate things if you ever want to sell, or if something happens to one of you." "I'm not planning to sell," Thomas said. "And as for something happening to me, well, I'd rather..." No, the ranch would stay with someone who loves it than have it go to some distant cousin who'd probably just auction it off. Over the next 2 weeks, they made several trips to town to handle paperwork and legal requirements. Ayana applied for a social security number and started the process of getting official identification. Thomas updated his will and business documents to reflect their new partnership, but the biggest decision came when Janet suggested that Ayana might want to contact her family to let them know she was safe. "You don't have to have a relationship with them," the lawyer explained. "But if they reported you as a missing person, it could cause complications later. At the very least, they should know you're alive and well." Ayana spent 3 days thinking about it before she finally agreed. She wasn't ready to forgive her family for abandoning her, but she also didn't want them to suffer. Thinking she was dead, Thomas drove her to the nearest town with a post office, where she spent an hour writing a letter in her native language. She sealed it carefully and handed it to the postal clerk, then walked back to the truck in silence. "What did you tell them?" Thomas asked gently as they drove home. "I told them I survived," Ayana said. "I told them I found a new family, one that accepts me as I am. And I told them that if any of them ever want to meet the woman I've become, they know where to find me." 3 weeks later, they got their answer. Thomas was fixing a water pump when he saw dust rising from the direction of the main road. A car was approaching the ranch, moving slowly as if the driver wasn't sure of the way. Ayana came out of the barn when she heard the engine. When she saw the old sedan pulling up to the house, her face went pale. She recognized the car immediately. "It's my mother and my sister Rosa," she said quietly. Thomas wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over to stand beside her. "Do you want me to stay or give you privacy?" "Stay," Ayana said quickly. "Please." The two women who got out of the car looked nervous and uncertain. Ayana's mother was older than Thomas had expected, with silver streaks in her long black hair. Her sister Rosa was younger, maybe 16, with the same dark eyes as Ayana. The reunion was awkward at first. Ayana's mother spoke little English, and Thomas couldn't understand most of what was said in their native language. But he could see the emotions playing across their faces. Surprise, relief, hurt, and slowly a cautious hope. Rosa spoke English better than her mother and served as a translator for Thomas. Through her, he learned that the family had been devastated when Ayana's letter arrived. Her grandfather had become ill with worry and guilt over what they had done. "He wants to see you," Rosa told her sister. "He wants to ask for your forgiveness." Ayana was quiet for a long moment. "Tell him I forgive him," she said finally, "but also tell him that I won't be coming home. This is my home now." Thomas invited the women to stay for lunch, and gradually the tension began to ease. Ayana's mother was amazed by the changes in her daughter, the confidence in her voice, the way she moved around the ranch like she owned it, the obvious happiness. In her eyes, after lunch, Ayana showed them around the property. She pointed out improvements she and Thomas had made, explained their daily routines, and talked about their plans for expanding the cattle operation. Her family could see that this wasn't just a place where she was staying temporarily. It was genuinely her home. When it was time for them to leave, Ayana's mother hugged her tightly and whispered something in their language that made both women cry. Rosa hugged Thomas too, thanking him for taking care of her sister. "She says you can visit any time," Ayana told him after translating her mother's final words. "And she says the family will always consider you one of us now." As the car disappeared down the dusty road, Thomas and Ayana stood together watching the sunset paint the desert sky in brilliant colors. The future stretched out before them like the vast landscape around their ranch, full of possibilities and challenges, but facing whatever came together. "No regrets?" Thomas asked. Ayana smiled and took his hand. "Only that it took me so long to find where I belonged." They walked back toward the house together. Two people who had been broken by life's hardships, but had found healing in the simple act of caring for each other and the land they now shared.